These are the real problems with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
What happened was true. The most bizarre and brutal series of crimes in America. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Even if one of them survives, what will be left? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. After you stop screaming, you'll start talking about it. Rated R.
The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is widely considered to be one of the scariest and most influential horror movies of all time. And there have been several sequels, including the most recent and much despised Texas Chainsaw Massacre that premiered on Netflix in 2022. Continuity issues aside, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre stands as one of the most prolific and popular horror franchises in the history of cinema. To celebrate its 50th anniversary, we are heading back to East Texas, and we're going to be talking about some of the more notorious aspects of this heinous and brutal shoot. But before then, we're going to be doing a little bit of a backstory of director Tobe Hooper. Hooper was a film student at the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. He had directed some acclaimed documentaries as well as an award-winning short film entitled Eggshells with Chainsaw co-writer Kim Hinkle. Hooper wanted to move into the horror genre after realizing art films had limited appeal with public audiences and that horror pictures was resonating with them much more and on a wider basis. At the time, Hooper was the only Texas-based director in the area shooting pictures. Many directors were brought in from California or New York to direct any major production that happened to be shooting in Texas. He found this as a local, he wanted to maintain the integrity of local filmmakers. He needed that one big hit film to really put him in the pantheon of some of the more well-known filmmakers, especially within the genre. Now, seeing the popular yet exploitative films such as Last House on the Left, directed by Wes Craven, Hooper and Hinkle were inspired to create their own shock horror film. They had subtitle ideas such as Head Cheese. They wanted to basically just call it Leatherface, but then they settled on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre as it evokes such bizarre curiosity. And this is one of the major aspects of the marketing for the film, was that it invites people in because, what is that? What do you want to see this? Anyway, so the script was inspired by crimes of mutilation and cannibalism created by the butcher of Plainfield, Ed Gein. Now, Hooper and Hinkle found their main inspiration for the character Leatherface in Gein. Now, Gein was notorious for wearing the skin of his victims and eating the flesh of freshly dug up corpses. He was also turning them into couches and furniture, lampshades, all that stuff. There are plenty of podcasts featuring Ed Gein, so if there is a curiosity of his heinous acts and crimes, you will be rewarded with endless material. Gein was also the inspiration for a couple of other popular characters such as Buffalo Bill and The Silence of the Lambs, and some say due to the maternal aspect of his life inspired Norman Bates in Psycho. The summer of 1973 would prove to be one of the most difficult summers for the cast and crew. The shooting schedule was beyond brutal. The cast and crew shot the film in the middle of August, 7 days a week, 10 to 16 hours a day. The film was the very definition of independent filmmaking, as everything was brought on by the specialties or availability of what the cast and crew could provide for themselves. This include props, costumes. For example, the blue Econoline van that the cast drives around in was newly purchased by the sound designer to basically transport and stow his equipment. They needed a van for the movie, and not having one at the time of the shoot, Hooper needed one and agreed to rent it out from him. Shooting in the van already created its first issues in terms of filming because they had to squeeze in about 5 to 6 people in there, cast and crew. You had to fit in your cameras, and this is of course in 1973, 74, when cameras, they're not smaller like they are today. You don't have digital cameras back then. You have the full reel 35mm cameras, so you're having to wedge this thing into the van and shoot it. The common thread that we're going to have in this episode is heat. The summer heat was blistering. Filming in the summer in Texas is going to affect a lot of the production. For example, in the van, they couldn't turn the AC on because, for one, it wasn't very operable, and two, whenever the van had the AC on, they had to turn it off because they were picking up the sound from the sound mic. It was creating a disturbance for the film. Not only are you crammed all these people in here, you're having to drive around because they obviously didn't have a green screen. So you're driving around in this van, no AC, it's packed with people, it's packed with equipment, and they had to film this for over 6 hours a day until they got it all done. And then you incorporated new characters into the shots. You had to shift people over, shift people around, and already it was off to not the best start in terms of planning and layout. The opening shot of the armadillo was purely an accident, as per Robert Burns, the production designer and art director. It was supposed to be a fake dead dog, But when the crew showed up to film the fake dog, they noticed a dead horse on the side of the road. Now, seeing as a major opportunity to use a larger animal, the crew decided to use the dead horse instead. They quickly moved past it as the rotten smell was so pungent that they couldn't breathe, and the limbs were coming off when they were even attempting to move it. Burns had liked the idea of a more uncommon animal to be featured in the opening shot. Now, the choice of the armadillo happened because they saw an upside-down one a little down the road, rather than trying to transport this large dead horse whose limbs are falling off. It was disgusting, it was decayed, an upside-down armadillo seemed like a much better alternative. Now, speaking of Burns' affinity for rotting animal corpses, he told a story about how he acquired all the animal bones and skins for the hook room, for the house, for pretty much anywhere you see bones or dead animals. Now, there were farmers in the area who would have dead cattle on their land that the counties refused to remove. Burns worked out a deal with the farmers and had their animal carcasses removed, cleaned, deboned, and he used those for the scenes. So anytime you see a bone or skull, those are real animal carcasses, cleaned as best as you can. The cast and remaining crew were impressed with his skill, quote-unquote skill, because of how authentic it looked and smelled. They were unaware that they were rolling around in dead animal bones. And even Tobe Hooper was surprised whenever he told him. Hooper was the only person that knew on the set because he didn't want to completely freak everybody out, or gross them out for that matter. The head of the makeup department, Dorothy Pearl, also worked for a veterinarian and had access to dead animals. So if Burns couldn't find any around the road or on the farms, he went to Dorothy Pearl. Burns would go to meet up with Pearl at the vet's office, find dead animals, pull them out of there, and again, the process started all over again. Deboned, cleaned. It's kind of disgusting. It's kind of gross. I mean, it's not kind of. That's pretty gross. Dorothy Pearl also had mentioned how she had used formaldehyde on the animal corpses to keep them semi-preserved for the shoot, otherwise they would decompose and not look the same on multiple shooting days. And Tobe Hooper always made the joke that he was relieved to hear Burns used liquid latex and fiberglass material for Leatherface's mask and not something worse. Aside from the brutal heat and rotten animals, the cast members each went through a dangerous issue on the set. Actor William Vail had a major head injury during the scene where Leatherface is revealed to bust him open with a meat hammer. This was the first time you see Leatherface on screen, so Hooper wanted a shocking and effective moment in terms of his reveal. Leatherface bludgeons the character into body spasms, something you didn't see too often as it looks way too realistic. That effect wasn't too difficult to achieve for William Vail. Unable to see clearly in the mask, Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, sliced a bit of his head with the meat hammer whenever he came down with it. The hammer was a real one, as the rubber prop was unavailable. Although Vail didn't sustain any major injuries, he did receive multiple stitches. Gunnar Hansen was about 6 foot 4 inches and 230 pounds. This was a mountain of a man, and of course he's the perfect person to be playing Leatherface. One of the main problems was that he never had a change of wardrobe. He had one costume for the entirety of the film, much like the rest of the cast did. Nobody was doing the laundry. They're shooting and sweating heavily in these costumes, and not to mention Gunnar sweating heavily in his costume, which had a little bit more layers than the rest of his summer wardrobed cast. He had the mask, he had the butcher's apron, he had, a short sleeve shirt, and he had long sleeve pants, and all of this, again, just constantly sweating and sweating. Naturally, he's going to build up a certain aroma that may not be appeasing to his co-stars. And in very case, they didn't like being around him when they weren't shooting because apparently he just reeked. And it wasn't necessarily him. It was just the fact that he was putting on these dirty clothes every single day. And again, nobody was washing the costumes. He even suggested that he take his costumes home and wash him ready for the next day. Of course, director Tobe Hooper was way against this notion because he's like, no, you have to look grimy. You have to look dirty. We have to have some of the spattered fake blood still strewn about your costume. So it would ruin the look of the entire character. Obviously, he didn't wash his stuff. And just being funky on set was a major problem for a lot of people, especially since he required a lot more space in the close proximity of some of these sets than the rest of his actors did. Now, for the scene's most notorious kill, in which Terry McMinn, who plays Pam, is hung onto the meat hook from her spine, I'm happy to report that this actually went off without a hitch. They were very particular and precise with this stunt because, she's getting hung up on her spine. So what they had was an attachment built into the back of her tiny spaghetti strap shirt, and somehow the mechanism worked perfectly, and the hook wasn't entirely real. It had some kind of rubber tip at the top, so that way it would slide right into that groove. Luckily, Gunnar Hansen, being 3 times her size, was able to pick her up like a child and put her onto the hook without any kind of problems. So I'm happy to say that the film's most notorious death scene went off pretty well. On the other hand, actress Marilyn Burns, who plays Sally Hardesty, a very iconic character in the pantheons of horror, as she's essentially horror's first final girl, endured multiple injuries in the final dinner scene alone, having the mallet that Grandpa was holding not be padded and falling on her head many, many times. I'm not sure where the prop master was, I'm not sure where the rubber mallet was, but Hooper refused to call for cut during the scene because her screams were real and it just seemed more visceral, and he wanted to keep that obviously fully intact. Also, in the scene where the old man assaults her in the gas station, the old man didn't want to hit her with the broom, so he was pulling his shots. They tried a rubber broom and that looked worse, so Hooper advised him to try it again and not pull his swings. He accidentally hit Marilyn Burns in the face multiple times, even once connecting over her eye, giving her a black eye. Now back to the dinner scene. The dinner scene took around 30 hours to film. That's right, 30 hours to film. Even though it was set at night, it was shot during the day when the temperature was the hottest. It didn't help all the windows and doors were closed and boarded up to make it look like it was nighttime. The reason why they shot it during the day is because with the cameras that they were using, having it shot at night didn't allow them for proper lighting of the scene. So they needed to bring in the fluorescent lights during the scene. So in other words, they basically had a fake nighttime just to get the proper shots. Now with the combination of the rotten animals and Gunnar Hansen's wonderful perspiration in the Leatherface suit, people were getting ill and vomiting all around the set. Cast was vomiting, the crew was vomiting, and one of the most horrifying moments of the scene, the grandfather is sucking blood out of Sally's cut finger. Now, the hitchhiker has to slice the finger before the grandfather could start sucking on it. First, a prop knife was used, which was meant to pump out fake blood. But when Hansen grew frustrated with the knife malfunctioning, he just decided to go on his own and cut her finger for real. This obviously led to a more horroring and haunting performance by Marilyn Burns, as she was literally bleeding everywhere. And it's one of those things where directors always want honest, visceral reactions from their cast and crew, especially in horror films. But I have to say that's the worst possible way to do that. She had to have multiple stitches on her finger. And not to mention the fact that when she jumps out of the window at the end of the scene, she cuts up her arms and slices her back up on the glass because the glass wasn't exactly plexiglass like they used for stunts. It was partially real and partially fake. The parts that were real ended up scraping her up pretty bad. So I would have to say that Marilyn Burns endured quite a traumatic shoot while filming this movie. Now, actor John Dugan, who plays Grandpa, was actually a young actor wearing a prosthetic mask. Now, the running gag about Grandpa's performance in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is that you look at him and he looks very much like he's wearing a fake mask. Like, it doesn't look like a naturally elderly actor there in the wheelchair. The prosthetics that they put on his face for them to stay still and for them to press against his skin left permanent scars because the adhesive that they were using on the mask stuck to his skin, and they had to basically rip the mask off of him and used all kinds of applications to get it without tearing too much of his skin. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. As I said, he had permanent scars due to it. He never really recovered from that. I would think with a movie being called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre that there was probably going to be some kind of incident involving said chainsaw. Well, I'm happy to report again that the chainsaw was one of the most heavily constructed props that they used in the film. They took really good care of it, and they really, really made sure that they had the blade and the teeth off of the main blade, because without the teeth, it's not going to cut into anything. You could still get rubbed up on it and it could still burn you, but it doesn't have the same kind of effect. There was one incident, though, involving Gunnar Hansen, where he was running around the set filming a scene, and he couldn't see very well, and so he slipped on a puddle of blood, and as he did that, he flung the chainsaw up into the air, and it came down, and it came really close to his face, with the blade still moving. So, luckily it didn't hit him, because even the body of the chainsaw itself, that could really have done some damage if it landed on his head, or anything like that. He came out pretty unscathed, and very lucky in that matter. Now that filming had officially wrapped and production was concluded, it was off to cutting the film in the editing room. Tobe Hooper was in there for close to a year. Just because of how much they shot, how much footage they took, he was basically in a battle with the MPAA ratings board about giving the movie the dreaded X rating due to its visceral and realistic look. Some of the MPAA board members were saying, this is a snuff film. Like, this isn't, they bought it as a real movie, a documentary rather than a fictional film, even though he was constantly reassuring them that, yes, this is a movie, these are my actors. He honestly thought the film deserved a PG rating, and his argument was that you don't really see too much blood or gore, which he's not entirely wrong, but I think he's underestimating the fact of just how captivating it is to see the content and how shocking some of this stuff is. And sometimes it's the things that you don't see paints more of a negative picture in your brain. They actually worked out a deal where it became rated R. Now, the film's box office return turned out to be a surprising success. Audiences were pulled into the theaters for various reasons. Some were curious about the brutal title, some assumed it was a nationally released snuff film, and others genuinely had an affinity for the horror genre altogether. Now, word of mouth also caught on that people were fainting due to the shocking nature of the film. So people were like, oh, well, we got to go see why people are passing out in the movie theater. Now, the film grossed a staggering $27 million on a $125,000 budget. Adjusted for inflation, that would be around $175 million today. The cast and crew were elated to the thought of receiving back-end pay due to their initial contracts being predicated in the success of the box office. Now, this turned out to be one of the most disappointing aspects of their journey. Not only did they feel like they should have been compensated for all the hell that they were put through, and the fact that they were waiting an entire year for this due to the cuts taking forever, they were very, very saddened to hear about some of the business decisions that were being made by the production company and some of its members. To acquire more of the financing needed to finish the picture and for distribution, producers Bill Horsley and Kim Hinkle of Vortex worked out an arrangement with a makeshift production company called Bryanston Productions. The financing came in on time, but the only problem was that Bryanston Productions was a company created by the mafia. This was the mafia's way to ingratiate themselves inside the movie business. They thought, we could find a way into the business and kind of take it over from there. Now, the head of the company, Bryanston Productions, was a mob boss by the name of Lou Perino, affectionately known as Lou Piranha by the cast and crew. Perino and the production company obviously withheld payment to many of the cast and crew or gave them very, very small amounts of money, way less than deserved. Many were fearful of taking legal action due to the potentially harmful repercussions that they would face by trying to take on a member of the mafia, but the producers insisted on legal action, but Perino gave them very little in the end. Some of the producers decided to go and take him to court, and guys in the mafia tend to not like those kinds of buildings, so they settled on a small sum rather than what was owed to them. Seeing that as a minor victory, they decided to take it and pay off the actors. Again, the actors didn't get paid nearly as much as they needed to, deserved, or were contracted for. This first clip is actually from Tobe Hooper's interview that he had done for the Masters of Horror documentary series. This is where he got the inspiration for the chainsaw to be the central weapon of our main villain.
So I was Christmas shopping, and I was in the hardware department. It was something like a Sears store, and God, I hate crowds. I hate them closing in on you. And so they were closing in, and I was kind of like freaking, just wanted to get out of there, get out of the crowd. And so I found myself in front of a chainsaw display in the hardware department, and that's where the idea came from. Well, if I pick this damn thing up and start it, they'll part like the Red Sea, and I can get out of here. Well, I didn't do that, of course, but when I got home, by the time I got home, and I think the entire structure seemed to come like in one package, maybe like a nanosecond, but the configuration of the hitchhiker, the cook, and then everything tumbling back into itself was like an instant, immediate notion that came out of that experience of wanting to get out of that crowd. Leatherface came from the family doctor, who told me when I was 10 or 11 years old that when he was in pre-med school, he skinned a cadaver's face and dried it out and wore it for a masked Halloween party. So, okay, that's cool.
Now, this next clip, also given by Tobe Hooper during his Masters of Horror interview, is something that is arguably the most shocking thing about this entire movie. I mean, we've already discussed so many things that have transpired during the production, but this, in my opinion, is probably the most shocking, and it deals with the human skeleton that you see at the beginning of the film.
We got the skeleton from India through a pharmaceutical company, and the real skeletons are less expensive than the plastic one. But I'm just wondering, where do they get these skeletons? Where do they have skeleton farms? How do they get perfect and they're cheaper than plastic ones?
Yes, you heard that correct. They used real human skeletons for the production of this movie. So if you were wondering why they look so real and authentic, that would be why. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was groundbreaking for the horror genre in many ways, pioneering the faux based on a true story subgenre decades before the Blair Witch Project and Paranormal Activity. It was a controversial film that sent shockwaves throughout the film industry upon its release due to its disturbing content, and was even banned in the UK for 25 years before they finally released it. A print of the film is still held in New York's Museum of Modern Art, so yes, therefore you could say it's a masterpiece. You can still visit Kingsland, Texas to see the house used in the film, although it has been converted into the Grand Central Cafe, which is family owned and operated to this very day. And luckily, I don't think they're serving people there, so I think it'd be safe to eat something. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is my all-time favorite horror film, and I wanted to celebrate its 50-year legacy by making it the first episode of Season 2 of the Real Problems podcast. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is my all-time favorite horror film, and I wanted to celebrate its 50-year legacy by making it the first episode of Season 2 of the Real Problems podcast. Thank you everyone for listening. If you have any comments, facts, or film suggestions, please feel free to contact me at realproblemspodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow the show on IG at realproblemspod and also on TikTok at realproblemspod. I would also like to thank the listening audience for listening to the show during its hiatus. We took quite a bit of a break. There's just been a lot of production issues. I kept trying to decide what movies I wanted to do for a slate of season 2, but I also really, really appreciated the warm reception given to me, people contacting me. Just the fact that you were still listening to the show meant so much to me. We have quite a few films to discuss this season, culminating on one of my all-time favorite films. Now, also, if you like this show, be sure to check out my other podcast, the Screen Addicts Podcast, a show about two friends and their endless quest to watch every film and television series possible. That show is also streaming on all available platforms, much like the Real Problems Podcast. Thank you. I'm Cinema Steven, and that's a wrap.
In a world of box office blockbusters and binge watching, a duo of friends have assembled together to watch everything ever created. They are the Screen Addicts, and they are here to deliver a podcast that is insightful, comical, and the greatest sound your ears will ever hear. Prepare to empty your watch list, as the Screen Addicts podcast is here to be your guide, now streaming on all available platforms or wherever you get your podcasts.